Welcome, all of you hunters of facts, seekers of knowledge, and to those just a little bit curious to FactSam. This is the first in a series called Who, What, Why, Where, and When, in which we will be exploring a wide variety of people, events, and places throughout history and answer the essential questions you may have about them. Or you may already know a bit about the topics which we will cover and just want to hear about them again. Whatever your reason for watching, all are welcome here. In this episode, we will be exploring the life and legacy of Alexander the Great. His name struck fear into the hearts of men. Alexander III of Macedon is today, despite a relatively short life, considered to be one of history's greatest and most influential people to have ever lived. His legacy and influence can still be felt around the world today, thousands of years after his death. But who was he? What did he do? And why did he do it? These are just some of the questions we hope to answer today. Alexander was born in Pella in 356 BC, the son of King Philip II of Macedon and his fourth wife Olympias. The exact date of his birth is widely disputed and is thought to be either the 20th or 21st of July. He spent his early years being raised by a nurse who was the sister of his future general Cleitus. During his childhood, he was tutored by Leonidas, a relative of his mother's. Throughout his childhood, he was taught in the manner all Macedonian nobles were, learning to read, play the lyre, ride, fight, and hunt. At the age of 10, he reportedly tamed a horse which had been brought to his father by a trader. This horse had refused to be mounted by anybody. Alexander supposedly deduced the horse's fear of its own shadow and turned it towards the sun. It was after this that Philip uttered the words, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you." Alexander kept this horse for most of his life, naming it Bucephalus, going as far as India together. Upon Bucephalus' death, Alexander named the city of Bucephala after him. At the age of 13, Alexander began his tutoring under Aristotle. At this time, Alexander especially became fond of the works of Homer, particularly the Iliad, which Aristotle gave him a copy of. Alexander would go on to carry this copy with him throughout all of his campaigns. Alexander ended his education under Aristotle at the age of 16. It was at this time Philip began his war against Byzantium, now Istanbul. During this war, he left Alexander in charge of Macedon as regent. It was also during this time that Alexander faced his first real test. The Thracian tribe of Mede revolted. Through quick action, Alexander managed to drive them out of their land, colonizing it with Greeks, and founded the city, calling it Alexandropolis after himself, a habit he would continue through the rest of his life. Upon returning to Macedon, Philip sent Alexander to deal with further revolts in southern Thrace. Philip then began a campaign into southern Greece, asking Alexander to muster an army. Philip joined Alexander in 338 BC, and together occupied Elati, which was a few days' march from both Athens and Thebes. The two cities formed an alliance against the Macedonian forces, and the two sides met in the Battle of Chaeronea. After a hard-fought battle in which Alexander played an important role commanding the left wing, the Macedonians emerged victorious, marching unopposed through the rest of southern Greece with the exception of Sparta. Philip then formed an Hellenic alliance and announced his plans to attack Persia. Upon returning to Macedon, Philip married Cleopatra Eurydice, the niece of his general Attalus. At the wedding banquet, a feud broke out between father and son, described by Plutarch as such. At the wedding of Cleopatra, whom Philip fell in love with and married, she being much too young for him, her uncle Attalus in his drink desired the Macedonians would implore the gods to give him a lawful successor to the kingdom by his niece. This so irritated Alexander that, throwing one of the cups at his head, "You villain," said he, "what am I then, a bastard?" Then Philip, taking Attalus' part, rose up and would have run his son through, but by good fortune for them both, Either his over-hasty rage or the wine he had drunk made his foot slip, so that he fell down on the floor, at which Alexander reproachfully insulted over him. "See there," said he, "the man who makes preparations to pass out of Europe into Asia, overturned in passing from one seat to another." After this, Alexander went into exile, fleeing to Illyria, around modern Croatia, but returned 6 months later after negotiations with his father. Then tragedy struck. Whilst attending his daughter's wedding in the summer of 336 BC, Philip was assassinated by the captain of his bodyguards, who in turn was killed whilst trying to flee. After this, Alexander was immediately proclaimed king of Macedon. It was a bloody start to Alexander's rule. Almost immediately he made moves to eliminate any political opponents. He had his cousin Amyntas executed, along with 2 Macedonian princes. He also ordered the death of Attalus, believing him too dangerous to be kept alive. His mother, Olympias, had Philip's wife Cleopatra and their daughter Europa burned alive, which made Alexander furious. News of the death of Philip spread quickly throughout Greece, leading states such as Thebes and Athens to rise up in revolt, as well as the Thracian tribes to the north of Macedon. Alexander first moved to secure his northern borders, before heading south to deal with the alliance Thebes and Athens had made, defeating and razing Thebes, which cowed Athens into submission and left Greece at peace. Alexander then began to plan his Asian campaign, aiming to finish that which his father had planned before his death. With an army of 48,100 foot soldiers, 6,100 cavalry, and 120 ships with 38,000 crew, Alexander crossed the Hellespont in 334 BC. He won the first of 3 battles against Persia at the Battle of Granicus in May 334 BC, before moving down the Ionian coast. In Gordium, Alexander faced the unsolvable Gordian knot. Different accounts are given as to how Alexander managed to solve this. Some say he took his sword and cut straight through it with one stroke, whilst others say he simply pulled the knot out of its pinpole. Alexander and his army then marched towards Syria. In November 333 BC, they met and defeated the much larger army of King Darius of Persia in the Battle of Issus. They proceeded to take Syria and the coast of Levant. In 332 BC, they held Tyre in modern Lebanon under siege, eventually capturing it and killing all the men of military age and selling the women and children into slavery. The army then marched on to Egypt with little resistance, except at Gaza, where Alexander was forced into yet another siege situation. During an attempt to take the city, Alexander received an injury to his shoulder. Upon the city eventually falling, the people of Gaza received the same treatment as those of Tyre. Alexander was welcomed and treated as a liberator in Egypt, and even pronounced as a son of Amun. In April 331 BC, he founded the city of Alexandria, which would go on to be the second most powerful city of the ancient world after Rome. We may come back to this great city in a later video. Alexander left Egypt in 331 BC, marching on to Mesopotamia, which is now northern Iraq, where he yet again met and defeated Darius at the Battle of Gaugamela. Darius fled yet again, and Alexander went on to capture Babylon. Alexander then proceeded towards the Persian ceremonial capital of Persepolis. Upon capturing it, he allowed his troops to loot the city and stayed there for 5 months. During his stay, part of the city was burned down, possibly in a drunken act of revenge. Alexander then resumed his pursuit of Darius, who was eventually betrayed and killed by his own men, led by Bessus, who in turn was later betrayed by his own men and executed. After defeating Persia, Alexander and his army marched further into Asia, founding yet more cities called Alexandria. It was also around this time that Alexander began to adopt many Persian customs at court, which caused him to lose respect among some of his army, particularly the Greeks. He also faced 2 attempts on his life, both of which were stopped. During a drunken quarrel, Alexander killed Cleitus the Black, a general in his army and the man who had saved his life in the Battle of Granicus. Alexander reportedly deeply regretted this afterwards. In 326 BC, Alexander turned his attention to pushing into India. After several more victories in the northwest of the subcontinent, his army reached as far as the Beas River, where they heard of the army that awaited them further into the country. This consisted of 80,000 horsemen, 200,000 footmen, 8,000 chariots, and 6,000 war elephants. Tired after much fighting, depleted courage, and a longing for home, his army refused to go any further and revolted. Alexander tried and failed to persuade them to keep going, and after supposedly sulking in his tent for 3 days, agreed with them. He then decided to return to Persia, losing many men in the Gadasean desert on the way. Alexander travelled to Ecbatana, where his closest friend Hephaestion suddenly died. This devastated Alexander, and it has been suggested that they were possibly lovers. Alexander then went on to Babylon, where he began to plan a campaign into Arabia. However, these plans were cut short as Alexander died on either the 10th or 11th of June 323 BC, at the age of 32. The exact date is unclear, as is the manner of his death. Some claim he developed a fever after a day of heavy drinking, whilst others claim he was possibly poisoned in an assassination attempt. Other suggestions include natural causes, such as malaria, typhoid fever, or white Nile virus. It is also believed his health had been in decline following years of heavy drinking and battle wounds, with grief possibly playing a part as well. On news of Alexander's death reaching Greece, it was so sudden that it was not initially believed. His body was placed into a gold sarcophagus filled with honey, then placed into a gold casket. After much discussion, his body was eventually brought to Alexandria and remained there for many years, later being visited by Pompey, Caesar, and Augustus, until eventually passing out with knowledge. The current location is unknown. After Alexander's death, there was initial peace, but in 321 BC, Macedonian unity collapsed into 40 years of war, after which the empire was split. Most of what was written about him at the time is now lost, and what we know of today comes from later writings. Alexander himself has left a lasting impact on the world, of which is still felt today. His campaigns allowed for greater contact and trade between East and West, with eastern areas becoming significantly exposed to Greek culture. Many of the cities he founded went on to become major cultural centres, many of which still survive today in the 21st century. The power vacuum left in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent allowed for the growth of the Maurya Empire, one of the most powerful Indian dynasties. Alexander was admired by many in Rome, particularly generals who aimed to emulate him and leaders who saw him as a role model. Out of the 20 battles he fought, he did not lose a single one, leading him to build an empire of 5,200,000 kilometers squared. This was only a very brief look at the short but extraordinary life of one of history's greatest men. If you wish to know more, there are plenty of films, TV shows and books written about him. Thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed the video, it would be greatly appreciated if you would leave a like. I have so much planned for this channel with this series, and a second I will be starting soon. So if you want to see more, then please subscribe. This is the first time I have done anything like this and can only improve with every video I do. Yet again, thank you for watching. I've been Faxam and I hope to see you again soon.